Hi, I'm Patricia Allingham Carlson, and this is how I painted Moland House, House. I hope you'll enjoy it and give it a thumbs up, and I hope that you'll subscribe. There's a little story that goes along with this painting. The property is actually in Warwick, Pennsylvania, and it's quite an historic property. I went to scope it out before I started a painting session there. General George Washington camped here with his men and was joined by General Lafayette. This was in the year 1777, and there was a huge battle being fought in this area right close to where I live. All the buildings were existing at that time, and on the property, I believe 13,000 men were camped. Walking around the house, it was a large structure made of stone and quite elaborately constructed. And out back, there was this well house. It's currently stuccoed. It could be stone underneath the stucco, but I found the house to be quite charming, and that's what I decided to paint. Returning with some friends, about a week later, we were all set to do a plein air painting session. We set up our little tables, got our paints out, got our paper out, and the skies were rather gray. One friend was discouraged and did not even attend. But the skies did open up and the rain did come down, so we had to pack things up. But we took a lot of reference photographs, and this is one of them that I used to paint my painting. Plein air sessions are a lot of fun, and they're a little bit hard to do and to plan for and to pack everything for. So after I got home, I made a video of all the things that I packed for it, and we'll be showing that in the future. What should you pack for a plein air watercolor painting session? Getting on to the painting, I think it's time to paint. I began with a sketch. The perspective was a little bit on the challenging side, but I worked at it and worked at it until I got it to my satisfaction. And what I did next was come in with some line work with watercolor on top of the sketch, so I'd have some good, clear starting and stopping points. I went around the outside edge of the house. Next, I covered the house with a piece of scrap paper and sprayed my water all around the outside background. And into this splattered wet area, I began to drop some concentrated paint. I concentrate my paint when I'm working wet on wet, just so that it doesn't dry very, very pale. The colors I'm using here are sap green, hooker's green dark, and some cobalt blue mixed with turquoise. I'm painting right up to the lines of the roof. And I'm leaving some unpainted areas to put in tree trunks that might have a slight contrasting color. Next, I came in with some yellow ochre. And I used burnt sienna to paint some tree trunks in. Now I've mixed some indigo into my Hooker's Green dark. And I'm coming in here and there with it in many places toward the ground where there's more shadows. I'm repeating on the other side and bringing some burnt sienna into the foliage area as well. Sometimes I blot at this point. Most often I leave the paint go where it wants to go, and then I'll do some adjusting later if I don't like where it chooses to go. Trying to keep the paint blotchy because it feels more like natural vegetation to me that way. On this side, I've brought some purple and mixed it into my dark greens as well. And I liked how it looked, so I brought it into some other places. Now I'm doing some splatter painting, which causes a random dappled type of effect. And I like splatter painting because this is a loose background. I've mixed some Indian red into some burnt sienna to paint some tree trunks, going back and reinforcing the darks near the ground. Burnt sienna mixed with a little bit of rose madder to add a little bit of a contrasting color. Now it was getting on the dry side, so I got it a little bit more damp with my mister, my plant mister spray, and I'm doing some splatter painting into the wet areas. I let the painting dry, and I'm coming into the next painting session. Now I've mixed some burnt sienna with some rose madder, and I'm painting in the tree trunks. The reason I'm using such a contrasting color is so that they will stand out from all the greens and blues in the background. These trees were much closer to the foreground, so I wanted to make them stand out. I finished up with the background and I'm moving on to the house. There was a faint glow in the sky that went between gold and almost pink, so I decided to paint the shadowed side of the house with some rose madder. I'm putting in the structure of the house and defining it by negative painting around it. This is the porch, and part of the background shows through, so that's what I'm painting. I have masked out a small wooden bench that sits on the porch, but I still have to paint around it so I can keep it in mind as to the rest of the painting. I'm adding some more darks into the background. I've never painted stucco before, so this was my first experience. And I was trying a lot of experiments. This was a learning painting for me, since I'd never done anything quite like it before with this building material. And I really do like trying new things and challenging myself. But I wasn't sure exactly how to do it or how it was going to turn out. What I do know is that in order to make a light color stand out, you want to paint darks around it. And that's what I'm trying to do here. For the recessed area of the stucco, I used a combination of rose madder and some purple. And now I'm bringing some of the purpley blues into the sunlit area to show shadows and some of the texture of the stucco. I'm defining out where the windows are on the house and painting around the bench. I've also decided to include some gardens into this house. Now, in reality, this house is sitting on a plain lawn, but I thought it would look attractive if I put some flowers in. I'm defining the darker side of the chimney, which is made of brick, and starting to define the structure of the front porch. There's a big door, and there's a grate of some kind that goes over top of it, I suppose for ventilation purposes. Now, this well house has the well going down on a lower level, and the level just inside the door has shelves because the whole inside of the well house is cool. In days before electricity, you needed to keep food cool so it would not spoil. Painting the shadows on that side of the house was quite intriguing. The photograph that I took had the overhang of the roof shadowing heavily on the stucco. And it was so dark versus bright that I loved the lighting and was trying hard to capture it. And I'm trying to paint the shadows and preserve the color and the texture that is underneath of it. I'm painting right down toward the bottom, but leaving a whole section for gardens to come up in front of it later. The window on these old buildings, with the windows are quite deeply recessed into the wall. So that's going to be an interesting little challenge as well. Each time I put a layer of shadowing color on, it tended to dry on the light side. So I think I have at least 3 layers of color by the time I'm done on the shadows. I was using a mixture of purple, indigo, and ultramarine blue for the shadows. I'm defining the bench a little bit more by painting the darkness that shows through it. And adding details, those little tiny details. did a lot of perspective adjusting all throughout this painting. And here I begin to lay out where the window panes are. Again, this window is set into the stone wall. I believe I painted the hinges several times because of the perspective changes too. I do turn the painting to try to keep the lines going in the right direction. And that's what you see I've done here. I'm putting in the line of shingles going across the roof. And I'm using browns and I'm using Payne's gray as well as ochre. My photographic reference has an awful lot of texture showing in the roof. So I'm laying in the texture. And the top roof showed a lot more light. So I've tried to leave some good strong whites showing through in that section. This building does not have a pathway going to it, but I thought that would add something nice. So I've masked in a white pathway, and now I'm masking in some whites for my flower beds. The property does actually have a beautiful new formal garden, which has been installed by a master gardener, but that's over in front of the main structure, not the well house. I decided to give the well house a garden as well. And that's what I'm masking out so that I can paint the lawns around it. I decided to add a little bit of the suggestion of a fence in the background as well. So I've masked some of that out. And doing a bit more masking in front of where the pathway would be. Back to the painting, I'm darkening my shadows again and my accents. When the masking is dry, I start to bring in some good strong lawn colors. Painting grass and lawns in a large area can be a little bit boring. So I use a variety of colors to add some interest to the foreground. I'm using sap green, I'm using hooker green dark, yellow ochre, some cadmium yellow, some burnt sienna, and some cobalt blue mixed with the greens. I'm working wet on wet and allowing the colors to run together. I'm hoping to create the illusion of a natural lawn by using all these different colors. My photograph reference had a strong shadow of a tree in the bottom right of the foreground. So I'm beginning to lay that in as well. Adding some darks around the fence area will allow the fence to show in more strongly in the middle ground. At the bottom of each garden area, I'm painting in some darks, because again, the flowers would be the darkest in their leaf work at the very bottoms, catching more light as they moved upward. And I'm building up these darks by using my greens mixed with indigo. I've also mixed a little bit of purple into my greens for these shadows. Time to take off the masking because it's dry. These are my blocked out flower garden areas. But I'm doing some adjusting on the house before I move to the gardens. I'm cleaning up the edges. Adding a little more texture into the stucco. And softening some of the lines of the window and the planks going across the front. Next, I decided to tackle the other window and darken the small window at the very top. To start the gardens, I painted a pot and started to put some geraniums into it, right at the front of the building. While that's drying, I go back to work on the house some more. And I'm laying in some shadows along the shingle line of the roof. Where the window panes are going to be, I'm darkening them up. This is a second layer of color going on, and there will be another layer as well. It was sort of awkward how the window frame overlaid the roof, but that's how it was built, and I'm trying to show it like it really is. The shingles actually stuck up a little bit, so they left a rough edge anywhere they met the house. And that is what I'm trying to paint in here. I'm adding a little spatter to the stucco to make it look the tiniest bit rough. yet with the bright sunlight shining on it, most of the roughness was sort of bleached out by the sun. I begin working on the window, finding where the panes are, finding where they're partially hidden by the frame from this angle as well. This was a challenging thing to do because it was not looking at a window from a straight on view, but looking at a very recessed window from an angle. So I took my time defining where things would go. And there was a lot of work done on that one window. I think I redid the panes several times. Because there was quite a few of them and they were small. At this point, I decided to darken some of the shading on the stucco and then darken around the bench some more. A lot of small details on this particular painting. And what color to paint the flowers. I brought my color wheel out to decide that one. I'm putting in some fence color for the background fence that I had laid out. And I'm using a mixture of burnt sienna and yellow ochre, and then brown for the fence that's closer up. Adding a little shading to the tree trunks in the middle ground trees. And darkening between the pickets of the fence. I decided to make this area of the gardens very warm in color family. Now the formal gardens have foxglove and sage, as well as some other flowers. So I decided to paint these foxgloves along with some lupine for this part of the garden. I had a photograph of the formal gardens, and they were all done in flowers with shades of magenta and pinks, purples, just absolutely gorgeous. So I'm painting the flowers in this section with those colors. And I'm looking at my reference photo from the formal gardens in front of the house. You know, there was also a statue just erected there. It was by a local artist who's very talented named Murray Gaiman. And he was very generous to commission or to allow his time and to donate his time to make this statue, which was just set up in the formal gardens, along with a gazebo. Beautiful thing to visit at the Moland House. I liked how the flowers made the whole painting start to come alive. So I set them up on the far side of the path as well as some on the closer side of the path. I included some irises from a photograph I had of my own garden, where the irises were really beautiful this year. And that's what I'm painting in the front left foreground. And then back to the windows where I'm doing some more darkening and defining. And much of this painting was done with buildup of color. As I created the painting, I was basing it on my reference photo, where the stucco is beautifully repaired and in stunning condition. I wanted to age the home or the well house a little bit. So I painted in some patches of missing stucco around the windows because I wanted it to look a little bit old. This is an old structure, several hundred years old, in fact. So you'll see the patches of missing stucco around the windows where I've noticed it's a likely place for it to fall off or to become damaged over the years in other structures of similar age around my area. And I liked that aged look. If you visit the historic property there, you'll see that it is all in perfect condition. It's been very well maintained. Adding a little more texture and some bumps and bruises on the stucco in the front of the property as well. And then I begin a patch of irises on the other side of the other side of the house, and continue to detail the gardens I've already painted, adding another layer of colors in some places. At this point, I've gotten out a utility razor knife, and I decided to break up some of the color areas with some white lines. So I'm gently scratching into the painting surface and bringing out some white, fresh paper that will sparkle through the colors. I'm adding branches. I'm scratching out some shading or highlights into the pots as well. And then I decided to add some gold color to the front of the house where the golden sunlight was hitting it. I liked that slight light effect that it gave me, and I added some to the foliage as well above the trees on the left side primarily. It gave the painting a warm glow. What I'm doing now is blending in the area that I had masked off in the front lawn because it didn't look like it was going to do anything that I wanted. So I blended it in with a damp brush, picking up some colors around it and making it less harsh. And now I'm adding some further darkening in the background. Time to paint the sage on the side of the house gardens. I've added water to this area, and now I'm painting in vertical lines of different colors, starting with ultramarine blue. After the ultramarine blue, I started adding vertical lines of purple. And a third layer was put on of magenta, because sage in my photograph showed up as quite a few different shades of purples and blues. I'm softening the white along the path, and I'm adding some shadows, so it's not all pure white, but showing the shadows of the flowers coming down across the path. To the bench, I've added a layer of yellow ochre. And with the sage a little bit dry, I've added some more layers on top of that. A few more branches on some of the middle ground trees. And the whole thing is beginning to come together. At this point, I am doing detail work. I'm finishing up the sage gardens, deepening some shadows, softening some lines as well. I'm coming in with some texturing work onto the lawns, making some vertical lines here and there into the grasses. I've used turquoise and I've used viridian. I don't want to have a highly grassy, liney lawn, but I did want to add some structure to it. Around the bench, I'm clarifying some of the breaks and negative shapes by painting more darks. And I'm also adding some shading lines to the bench itself. I went outside and picked some leaves and some plants because I want an overhanging branch in front of the whole painting. I also decided that the front left foreground needed a little bit of interest. So starting with the top, I've sprayed down an area where a branch is coming in front of the whole picture. And to that wet area, I'm applying paint in a very loose and dabby method, allowing the water to spread it around. Again, I'm using hooker green dark, I'm using sap green, and I'm using a little bit of yellow ochre as well as some cadmium yellow. There are many trees around the property, and in one of my photograph references, this branch was hanging in front of everything. I thought it framed in the painting nicely and added an air of informality to it. So I'm dabbing the paint, I'm splattering the paint, and I'm making sure I get it dark enough so it won't fade out into nothing, because it should be quite dark and almost silhouetted in some areas. I've mixed a lot of indigo in to get some good dark colors as well. I use a lot of indigo. It's a real go-to color for me. For the front left foreground, where I thought it needed an interest area, I decided to paint in some iris leaves that might be growing in a clump for closer to the house and closer also to the viewer. So I've started with some dark colors, and then I'll actually be taking some paint off to make some light areas. Doing a little bit of comparison by covering side to side and seeing how it looks. I'm adding some clumps of grass, some shaded areas that are going in a slight diagonal direction in the opposite angle of the way the house is going. I thought it might create a nice little dynamic tension in the painting. A little bit more yellow and gold into the front of the structure. And some accent work as well. And I'm signing my name and it's done. I hope you enjoyed my painting, Moland House, Well House, step by step. I hope that you'll give it a thumbs up and subscribe. And maybe you learned something that would be useful to your own artwork. I have links below to click on so you could see my art page on Facebook, my blog about art and life, and some products that I use. I also have a link to my own art products page where purchases can be made of my image on all kinds of things. Your comments are always welcome. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next video.